The smell of pine resin and old snow hit her before the wagon even crested the ridge. Opaline Vance was 22 years old, sitting on a buckboard with a cracked seat and a feed sack between her feet that held everything she had not burned, sold, or left behind in Caldwell Creek. Her uncle had shaken hands with a stranger named Rowland Fitch over a debt that wasn't hers to carry. $48 and a barrel of salted pork, dove. That was what her next 3 years were worth. The town had watched her go with the particular satisfaction of people who had always expected her to come to nothing. They were about to be wrong. Rowland Fitch didn't look at her when he climbed down from the wagon to open the gate to his property. He was a broad man, not tall, but built like a draft horse, with hands that looked as though they'd been broken and reset more than once. His coat was oiled canvas, cracked at the shoulders. His hair was dark brown, going gray at the temples, and he wore it pushed back under a battered felt hat that had no business being worn in polite company. Though Opaline suspected polite company was not a concept, Rowland Fitch spent much time worrying about. He had not spoken a single word to her in the 4 hours it had taken to climb into the Absaroka Range. Not when she'd asked how far. Not when the wagon hit a washout and pitched her sideways into the side rail, hard enough to bruise her hip. Not when the temperature dropped so sharply that her breath came out in white plumes and the tips of her ears went numb under her thin wool scarf. He didn't speak until the cabin came into view through the lodge poles. 3 boys, he said, his voice a low, flat gravel. 14, 9, and 6. Their grandmother raised them until December. She died. They've been on their own since. Opaline stared at the cabin. It was sturdily built, at least. Chinked log walls, a good stone chimney, but the yard around it was a disaster. A broken axe handle lay in the mud. 3 chickens were loose, picking at something indeterminate near the porch steps. A rusted iron pot had been abandoned on its side, next to the woodpile. "What happened to their mother?" Opaline asked. Rowland's jaw tightened. "She left." He said it the way a man says the word when the truth of it is still somewhere in his chest, lodged like a splinter too deep to reach. Opaline didn't press it. The wagon stopped. Before Rowland had set the brake, the cabin door swung open, and a boy appeared in the frame. He was tall for 14, wiry in the way of boys who worked hard and didn't eat enough, with dark eyes and a jaw already set in a stubborn line that reminded Opaline uncomfortably of her own reflection. He was holding a splitting maul at his side, not raised, just held, in the casual way boys hold things when they want you to know they have them. Behind him, 2 smaller boys crowded the doorway. The 9-year-old had a smear of something, grease or mud or both, across his forehead. The 6-year-old was barefooted despite the cold and clutching a dead rabbit by the ears with the serene confidence of a child who saw nothing unusual about this. "Who's she?" the oldest said. Not a question. "Opaline Vance," Rowland said, stepping down. "She's going to keep the house and cook. Her name is Opaline. You'll treat her accordingly. We don't need anyone. Everett." Rowland's voice didn't rise. It just got quieter, and somehow that was worse. "Put the maul back on the block and come help unload." Everett stared at Opaline for a long, flat moment. His eyes moved over her with the cold assessment of a boy who had learned very young not to trust anyone new. Then he turned, set the maul against the porch post with deliberate slowness, and walked back inside without another word. Opaline picked up her feed sack and climbed the steps. The 6-year-old, still holding the rabbit, stepped directly into her path and looked up at her with eyes the same dark shade as his brother's. "Our last housekeeper cried," he said helpfully. "Good for her," Opaline said, and stepped around him into the cabin. The smell was the first thing. Stale wood smoke and unwashed wool, and something sweet and rotten she traced to a pot of something unidentifiable, sitting on the back of the stove that had been there, by the look of it, for at least a week. The floor was swept. Someone had been trying, but the corners held drifts of pine needles and ash. There were dishes in a bucket of water gone cold and gray. Boots lined up near the door in descending size, which meant someone had taught them that much at least. The grandmother, maybe. Opaline set her bag down on the table. She didn't take her coat off. She walked to the stove, lifted the lid off the pot, and nearly gagged. She carried it outside and emptied it behind the woodpile without ceremony. "That was supper," said the 9-year-old from the porch. "No," Opaline said. "It was a biological incident. What's your name?" He blinked. Callum. I need firewood, a full water bucket, and someone to tell me where your grandmother kept the salt pork." Callum stared at her for a moment. Then, without entirely meaning to, he went to get the firewood. The first week was not survivable by any reasonable metric. Opaline had grown up poor. But poor in town meant cold rooms and thin soup and a mattress shared with two cousins. It did not mean hauling water up a 40-degree slope in the dark before anyone else was awake. It did not mean three boys who treated every attempt at order as a personal declaration of war. Everett was the worst because he was the smartest. He didn't do anything obvious. He would let the fire go low while Opaline was hanging laundry, then look confused when she came back to a cold hearth. He would give Opaline inaccurate information about where things were kept, delivered with a face of such perfect blankness that she couldn't prove intent. He watched her, constantly, cataloging her reactions, testing where she would break. Callum was chaotic rather than strategic. He broke things, lost things, forgot things, and left a trail of catastrophe through every room he entered. He wasn't malicious. He was 9 and had been largely feral since December, and he had an attention span that seemed physically incapable of sustaining focus for longer than 4 minutes at a stretch. The youngest, whose name was Pryor, followed Opaline around the cabin for the first 3 days without speaking. He just appeared at her elbow while she was kneading dough or scrubbing the table, watching her hands with that unnerving 6-year-old intensity. On the 4th day, he tugged the hem of her skirt while she was stirring cornmeal and said, without preamble, "Are you going to leave like Mama did?" Opaline kept stirring. "No," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." Pryor considered this for a long moment, as though it were a more reassuring answer than most. Then he climbed onto a stool and watched her cook. And after that he stopped following her like a ghost and started following her like an assistant, handing her things she didn't ask for, and occasionally handing her things that weren't useful at all, like a horseshoe nail or half a pine cone, with the gravity of a person making a significant contribution. Rowland came home after dark most nights. He was running a small timber operation in the high draw with one hired hand who Opaline never met. He ate whatever she put in front of him without comment, good or bad, and then sat by the fire for a short while in silence before going to bed. He did not tell her she was doing well. He did not tell her she was doing poorly. He did not tell her anything that wasn't functional. On the 8th day he said, "The axle on the supply wagon needs grease. There's a can in the lean-to." On the 12th day he said, "You're using too much of the salt pork. Stretch it with beans." On the 14th day, Opaline stretched a month's worth of salt pork with beans, made the bread come out right for the first time at altitude, and found Callum's missing boot wedged up in the chimney corner where he'd apparently hidden it to avoid having to wear it. And she looked at the 4 plates of food she'd set on the table and felt a pressure behind her sternum that she couldn't decide was rage or grief or something that didn't have a clean name. She sat down and ate her own supper in silence. It was the sickness that broke the standoff. It always is, in houses like that one. Rowland had gone up to the high draw for what was supposed to be 2 days. A timber contract required him to get the last load down before the trail froze. He left before dawn on a Monday, and by Tuesday afternoon Pryor was on the floor of the cabin unable to stand. It came on fast, the way sickness does in small children. 1 hour he was dragging a stick across the hearthstones making a sound designed to remove a person's sanity, and the next he was lying still in a way that wasn't sleep. Opaline pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, and felt the heat radiating off him like a that had been sitting in the sun all afternoon, except it was November, and there was no sun, and the temperature outside was dropping toward 0. "He gets sick easy," Callum said from the doorway. His voice was careful in the way children's voices get when they're trying not to sound scared. "Last year he had the fever for 5 days. Grandma said we almost lost him." Opaline looked at the child on the floor. She felt the thin, bright wire of panic pull across the back of her chest. She had no medical training. She had no doctor within 20 miles. She had a boy burning up in a cabin on a mountain in November, and the man who was theoretically responsible for these children was somewhere in the high timber and could not be reached. "Everett," she said. The oldest boy appeared in the interior doorway. His face was very still. I need the extra quilts from the loft. I need more firewood than you think I need. And I need you to tell me everything your grandmother did when Pryor had the fever last year." There was a long pause. Everett looked at his brother on the floor. Something moved across his face that he didn't have the age or the practice to hide. Something raw and terrified. The face of a boy who had already lost too many people and recognized the shape of losing another one. "She made him sweat it out," Everett said. "Kept him wrapped up. Kept the fire high. She made a tea out of dried elderberry and something else, I don't know what it was. She kept it in a tin on the second shelf." Opaline was already moving toward the shelf. There were 4 tins. She opened them all, smelled each one, and found the one Everett meant, dark dried berries with a faint, sharp, medicinal smell. She had no idea if elderberry tea was the right treatment or folk medicine or both. It didn't matter. It was what she had. For the next 3 days, the cabin became its own closed world. Opaline slept in 2-hour intervals on the floor beside Pryor's pallet, waking to check his temperature, to coax sips of liquid into him, to rewrap him when he threw the quilts off in his restless heat. She kept the fire so high the chimney stones were warm to the touch. She changed the damp cloth on his forehead every hour. Everett stopped undermining her. He just showed up and did things, hauled wood without being asked, kept Callum quiet, heated water when she needed it. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. The emergency had dissolved the war into something else, a temporary alliance born out of shared fear, and both of them were smart enough not to examine it too closely. On the second night, Pryor's fever spiked so high he stopped making sense. He talked about his mother. He talked about something he called the yellow dog, which Opaline was fairly certain did not exist, and his voice was thin and far away, and the sound of it put a cold fist in the center of her chest. She picked him up, he weighed almost nothing, and held him against her chest, rocking slightly, not because she thought it would help the fever, but because it was the only thing she could do. She was not this child's mother. She was a stranger who had arrived 2 weeks ago with a feed sack and no choices. But she held on and kept rocking, and sometime before dawn the fever broke. She felt it go, the heat receding in a wave, his breathing deepening, his small body going loose and heavy against her shoulder, the way children go when they finally genuinely sleep. Opaline sat in the chair, with Pryor slumped against her collarbone, and looked at the gray dawn light coming through the window and did not cry. She was well past crying. She was on the other side of something that didn't have a word for it yet. The cabin door opened just after first light. Cold air rolled in across the floor. Rowland stood in the doorway, coated in trail dust and 2 days of exhaustion, his hat in his hand. He took in the scene. The fire burned low but still going. Opaline in the chair with Pryor against her chest. Everett asleep on the rug with his boots still on, and went very still. He stepped inside. He set his hat on the hook. He walked to the fire and added 2 pieces of wood, with the careful quiet of a man moving in a house where people were sleeping. Then he stood with his back to the room for a long moment, and when he turned around his face was the same closed, weathered thing it always was, except around the eyes where something had shifted. "How long?" he said quiet. 3 days, Opaline said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "He broke last night." Rowland looked at his youngest son's face, slack and peaceful in sleep, and the muscle in his jaw moved. He reached out and put the back of his hand to Pryor's forehead, checking the temperature with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had done it before. "You stayed up," he said. "Not a question. Someone had to." He looked at her then, directly, the way he almost never did. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or it wasn't only gratitude. It was the look of a man recalibrating something he'd believed to be a certain way. "Go sleep," he said. "I have it from here." Opaline transferred Pryor's weight carefully. Rowland took the boy with the practiced ease of a father and settled into the chair with him, and Opaline went to the pallet in the corner and lay down without taking her boots off, and was asleep in under a minute. When she woke up, someone had put a blanket over her. March came sideways, the way it does in the mountains. A week of false warmth, followed by a late blizzard that buried the porch steps to the second board, followed by a thaw that turned the yard into a lake of brown mud. Opaline had stopped counting the days sometime around January, which she took as a sign that she had stopped thinking of the arrangement as temporary. The boys had changed, not all at once, and not without backsliding. Callum still broke approximately one thing per day and seemed genuinely baffled each time by the laws of physics and consequence. Pryor had attached himself to Opaline with the total commitment of a child who has decided you're safe, which meant he was underfoot constantly, and she had stopped minding. Everett was the last and the most careful. He didn't warm to her the way the younger boys did. He watched her. He measured things. But somewhere in February, he had started teaching Pryor to whittle without being asked, using techniques Opaline had seen Rowland use, which meant he was watching his father too, and filing things away, and slowly deciding what he thought of them both. In early April, Rowland said they needed to go to Harwick for supplies. Harwick was the nearest town, a 2-hour drive down the mountain. Population perhaps 300 people who had strong opinions about everyone else's business. Opaline had not been off the mountain since September. She didn't say that out loud. She just went to get her coat. The drive down was different from the drive up. The same buckboard, the same 2 horses, the same mountain road winding between the lodge poles. But Rowland didn't sit at the far edge of the seat the way he had in September. There was simply less distance between them, the kind of distance that closes over a winter without anyone deciding to close it. And when the wagon hit a deep rut in the April mud and Opaline grabbed the seat rail, her knuckles brushed against the back of Rowland's hand on the reins, and neither of them moved away. Harwick had the particular quality of a small town that has nothing to do but notice things. She felt it the moment the wagon came down the main street. The heads turning, the conversations pausing, the quick shuttling of glances between people who already knew what they thought and were looking for confirmation. They had expected something broken. That was clear. They had expected either a woman who'd been ground down or a story about why Rowland Fitch had come down alone. Instead, Rowland pulled the wagon up in front of Aldersham's general store, an entirely different man than the Aldersham she'd met in passing the previous fall, and climbed down and then, without ceremony, reached a hand up for Opaline. She took it, stepped down into the mud. Inside the store, a woman named Dora Hibbs, who Opaline had been told ran the ladies' auxiliary and knew everyone's business before they did, was standing near the fabric bolts with the look of a woman who has come to a store for the express purpose of witnessing someone else's situation. Opaline didn't look at her. She walked to the counter and gave Aldersham her list: flour, salt, lard, dried beans, baking powder, a bolt of heavy canvas for patching the boys' winter trousers, and a small paper sack of horehound candies that she did not explain and did not need to. Aldersham looked at her. He looked at Rowland, who had come to stand behind her shoulder. He started filling the order. "You made it through the winter, then," Dora Hibbs said, from near the fabric bolts. Her voice had the particular brightness of someone who expected a more interesting response than they were about to get. "We did," Opaline said without turning around. "Rowland's boys give you much trouble?" There was a silence. Opaline set a coin on the counter for the candy. "They gave me exactly the right amount," she said. Rowland made a sound beside her. It was brief and low, something between an exhale and a laugh, the kind of sound a man makes when he's caught off guard by something that pleases him. Dora Hibbs opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Rowland stepped forward and put his hand flat on the counter. "Add a pound of coffee," he said to Aldersham. He glanced down at Opaline. "You've been drinking that stove-burnt nonsense since January." "I didn't complain," Opaline said. "I know you didn't," Rowland said. "That's why I'm buying the coffee." The ride back up the mountain was quiet, in the way their silences had become, not empty, but occupied. Pryor was asleep against Opaline's side inside 10 minutes of leaving town, and Callum was in the back making a generally impressive amount of noise for one child, and Everett sat beside him with his arms crossed looking long-suffering and 14. The mountain rose up ahead of them in the late afternoon light, the snow line still high on the peaks, but the lower slopes gone green and gray-brown with early spring. The air smelled of snowmelt and pine, and the particular cold mud smell of a high country road in April. Opaline looked at the peaks and thought about September, the woman she had been sitting on this same buckboard, going in the opposite direction, gripping the side rail with white knuckles, watching a town full of people who expected her to fail until it disappeared behind the tree line. She had not thought then that she would still be here in April. She had not thought further than surviving the week. She was still here. She had not just survived it. She had made something out of it. The bread came out right every time now. She knew which shelf held the elderberry tin and which board in the loft floor creaked, and exactly how far you had to push the damper in to keep the fire overnight without burning through the wood. She knew that Callum would not eat anything with onions in it, but would eat anything if you told him it didn't have onions in it. She knew that Everett's left boot heel was wearing down faster than the right. She knew that Pryor woke from bad dreams easily and that the fastest way to settle him was a hand on his back and no talking. She knew that Rowland drank his coffee black and too strong, and that he sharpened every blade in the cabin on Sundays, and that he had a way of looking at a problem, an axle, a broken fence rail, a boy in trouble, where he got very still and quiet and then simply moved and fixed it. No announcement, no discussion. She knew that when Pryor had been sick and she'd been running on no sleep for 3 days, and Rowland had come home to find her in that chair with his son, the thing that had moved across his face in that moment was not just relief. She hadn't let herself look at that too long. There wasn't time yet for looking at things like that. There was still wood to be hauled and bread to be made and 3 boys to be navigated and a mountain to be lived on above. But spring was coming. The trail was opening. The days were getting longer. The wagon rolled through the tree line and the cabin appeared in the clearing, smoke drifting from the chimney. Everett must have banked the fire before they left, and the late light fell across the log walls in long amber bars, and it looked, from this angle, like a place that could hold people. Rowland pulled the horses to a stop. He sat for a moment with the reins loose in his hands, not moving to climb down. "The south pasture fence needs restringing," he said. "Post by the big spruce rotted through over winter." "I saw that," Opaline said. A pause. "I could use another pair of hands on it," he said, "if you've got a morning free this week." Opaline looked at the cabin. She looked at the fence line. She thought about everything she still had to do and everything she had already done, and the weight of a winter survived, and a child who had asked her if she was going to leave and been satisfied by the answer that she had nowhere else to go. She thought about the fact that nowhere else was no longer the whole reason. "Wednesday," she said, "after the bread's done." Rowland gave a single nod. He climbed down from the wagon. He reached a hand up for Pryor, who transferred without waking, drooping against his father's shoulder, with the total boneless faith of a sleeping child. Opaline climbed down on her own side and followed them through the cabin door, into the warm smell of banked fire and pine, and the particular lived-in air of a house that had people in it who intended to stay.